My name is André Gandy, and for the History of Motion Picture Art's final project, I will be discussing the history of the thriller genre. The thriller has been around since the early days of film and has had a lasting impact on cinema. The genre includes works by notable filmmakers and some of the most notorious titles canonized into film history. The genre has contributed conventions and techniques that have had a lasting impact on the overall technique of filmmaking. The thriller genre includes a myriad of subgenres and has notable moments in history where there exists crossover between other cinematic genres. One key concept of the thriller is the notion of feelings that delight the terrible, the down-to-earth, immediate sense of terror that is more real in comparison with the horror in films including a fictitious monster. The thriller relies heavily on the manipulation and orchestration of the minds of audiences, often playing on a keen understanding of real-life current events. A fine example is Hitchcock's The Lodger, which was released only 30 years after Jack the Ripper, and Zodiac, released in 2007, both of which play on audiences' real fears and the occurrence of serial killers. The suspense in a thriller film is generated when the audience anxiously waits for something to happen, a process meticulously crafted by the filmmakers. Inferring meaning through the use of cinematic shot selection and editing are integral. The specific technique of intercutting context shots and close-ups in order to create tension and infer meaning is something known as the Lev Kuleshov effect. Although the facial expression of the character may contain no differences, the audience's understanding of the emotion of the character is based on the specific close-ups intercut. Subjective camera technique enables the audience to focus on specific things the characters see. Subjective camera combined with the Lev Kuleshov effect pioneered in the thriller are techniques used in a plethora of genres. Safety Last from 1923 is arguably the first example of a film from this genre as one of the first stunt-driven action movies. The Lodger by Alfred Hitchcock was released in 1926. Spies by Fritz Lang, which is an example of the espionage thriller subgenre, created a blueprint for subsequent spy movies that exist into the present day. 30s and 40s saw the rise of the thriller genre and the prominence of the master of suspense himself, Mr. Alfred Hitchcock. In 1936, he released The Sabotage. This film is a fine example of the Lev Kuleshov effect. Alfred Hitchcock is quoted in saying, "There is no terror in the bang, only in the anticipation of it." As the thriller continues on through the 1930s and 40s, there are a myriad of thriller films including The Most Dangerous Game, Spellbound, Shadow of a Doubt, Double Indemnity, The Third Man, and Notorious. Double Indemnity is an example of the film noir thriller hybrid crossover. It is also worth noting that these films occurred during the Hays Code era when it was incredibly restrictive for directors to portray notions of violence, sex, and crime on film. Into the 1950s, we have the release of The Wages of Fear, North by Northwest, and Vertigo. North by Northwest is a fine example of the conspiracy subgenre of thriller, and Vertigo, while commercially unsuccessful at the time, is now revered as a prolific example of the psychological thriller subgenre. Into the 1960s, Alfred Hitchcock solidified his prowess as the master of suspense with the 1960 release of Psycho. Other important films from this era are 1963's High and Low by Akira Kurosawa, Blow Up, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. To the 1970s, notable titles are All the President's Men, Francis Ford Coppola's The Conversation, and of course Steven Spielberg's Jaws. In the 1980s, we have the Brian De Palma film Blowout, which is an example of the conspiracy subgenre and a nod back to the film Blow Up, released in 1966. To the 90s, there are creative and commercial successes such as Misery, The Silence of the Lambs, Jurassic Park, and Pulp Fiction, an example of the action thriller subgenre. Crossed over into the new millennia with notable films such as Zodiac in 2007 and No Country for Old Men, same year. Titles include Christopher Nolan's Interstellar and the psychological thriller Black Swan. The fact that the thriller genre in cinema has lasted over 100 years speaks to the direct relation between the minds and psychology of audiences and the ability for filmmakers to collaborate, create, craft, and capture stories that relate to one of our key psychological components as human beings.